Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video I want to share with you a few of my favorite soups. These soups are fantastic for nursing moms and just people on the go. I really think it's so important that if you want to have a great life, you need to set yourself up for success. And that means having either a well-stocked freezer or a well-stocked pantry of things that you will eat and that will fuel you, like healthy food. So just to give some running commentary on this, in addition to what I'm already saying, that butternut squash was about 4.5 pounds. I am going to treat it as if it's a 4-pound squash, and I'm just going to follow the recipe as if I were doing a 4-pound squash. I'm going to give you a little word of warning here. I'm going to put the actual recipe in the description box, but I didn't quite follow the recipe, you'll see, because when I pour in, I think I used the chicken stock for this, and when I poured it in, I don't think I had cooked it long enough. Like I hadn't, if you're familiar with how to make stock, you have to boil it for a really long time. So I hadn't done that, and so I felt like the flavor wasn't as developed, it wasn't as strong. The flavor gets stronger the longer you cook it, whether it's vegetable stock or chicken stock. Vegetable stock doesn't have to cook as long, but chicken stock does. And so in this recipe, I am putting in a lot more stuff than the recipe actually calls for, because I want to throw in a little bit more flavor, because I know that the stock is not as strong of a flavor. So I just wanted to give that little heads up in case you head over to the description box and you see that it's a different recipe. Understand that the additional vegetables that I am throwing in is simply because of the added flavor that I wanted. But it's actually really a very simple recipe. I think off the top of my head, I believe it's like 2 pounds of vegetable per 1 onion. This is called a cream of any vegetable soup, so literally you can make this with any vegetable. I think it's 2 pounds of vegetable to 1 onion, and then I think it's 1.5 quart of vegetable stock, which I used chicken stock. And then I believe it's like a cup of creamer and salt and pepper to taste. Plus a roux, which I don't believe in dirtying extra pots. I think after I had kids, probably after my first or second kid. By the way, I had that butternut squash sitting for a while in my cabinet. And it developed, like if you look at the color of it, okay, it's very starchy, so it's hard to get off the knife and the cutting board. Because I had it sitting for a while, it ripened even further, and so it has that like nice deep orange color. It looks like cheddar cheese, and oh my gosh, I wanted to eat it like it was cheddar cheese, because I love cheddar cheese. But it's not cheddar cheese, it is butternut squash. But yeah, it does develop if you buy the butternut squash a little bit in advance of when you want to use it. Like I bought it intentionally like a month or two ago. Well, I mean a month or two before I made this soup, and I bought it with the intention of letting it sit in my pantry for a little bit because I wanted it to develop that nice orange color. Otherwise, if you just buy a squash from the store and use it immediately, you do run the risk of having like a little bit more of a pale color squash. Nothing wrong with it, but the longer you let it sit, the more flavor it develops. Obviously, if you're home growing it, then that's a totally different ballgame. But if you do buy it from the grocery store like I did, then definitely let it sit in the pantry for like at least a month. Obviously, keep it in a cool, dark place. You don't want it to get like warm and moldy and, go bad. But keep it in a cool, relatively cool. Obviously it doesn't have to be kept refrigerated, if your kitchen doesn't get too hot, or if you have I keep it in a cabinet. Actually, I keep it in the cabinet next to my dishwasher, but that cabinet doesn't get hot. My point is that I don't keep it in the cabinet next to my oven. I keep it on the other side of my kitchen because I don't want the cabinet with my squash or my potatoes, things like that. I don't want those items to heat up and go bad. So any kind of pantry items that you don't need to store in the refrigerator, just make sure that you're storing away from the oven or any major source of heat in your kitchen or in your house. That's a tip for just storing vegetables, which I wasn't planning on sharing, but I'm sure that will come in handy for somebody, so I hope it's helpful. Okay, so yes, this butternut squash soup, I will tell you, I really wish I could. I could do whatever I want. That's the truth. So I could have if I wanted to. You'll see there's 2 pots on the stove. One has the chicken stock that is bubbling. At least I hope it's bubbling. But I would like to normally make this butternut squash soup in a larger pot. And I'm going to caution you against doing that. It is such a delicious recipe. So I want to like triple the recipe, quadruple the recipe, but I will tell you that you'll see, I think when I'm making this soup, I think I do go and get another spoon. Because that spatula, it's wonderful, but when you have so many vegetables, okay, is that a potato? Yeah. Oh my gosh, okay. This recipe doesn't call for any of that stuff. Basically, it calls for like heavy cream or milk or something like that. And because I don't have oat milk in the house and I'm not doing so great on soy milk, so I don't like to make my soups dairy. So we don't do so great on dairy in the house, so I only do it like on special occasions or random occasions. But most of my soups are either like vegan, non-dairy, non-meat, whatever, or they're made with like chicken stock, something like that. But I don't like to make my soups dairy, so I like to use a non-dairy milk. But I don't think my baby's allowed to have soy, and I'm not so sure I'm allowed to have soy either. But while I'm nursing him, I'm trying to lay off the soy. So I didn't have another alternative for milk in the house. And I do feel like that recipe does need the milk for like the creaminess factor. Okay, that is yellow squash. I think I'm throwing about a pound in. Or maybe not. I'm throwing a few handfuls in. Okay. I'm throwing in yellow squash. Again, the recipe doesn't call for this, but this is just for like the flavor because the chicken stock is not that developed. So yeah, I threw in the potatoes for like the creaminess factor because I didn't put in the milk. You'll see I'm only putting in water and chicken stock. And so I did feel like the potato was gonna be my like creamy milk, sort of. So basically what I do is I saute all the vegetables. The way the recipe goes is you first saute the onions for a few minutes, then you saute the butternut squash also for like 3 to 5 minutes. I don't do it for 3 to 5 minutes. I just do it until I'm done and like everything looks soft. When I say I'm done, okay, you see, there I'm grabbing that spoon. I doubled the recipe, like instead of using 2 pounds of squash, I use 4. Okay, so here you see me making the roux. I know I'm jumping around. I'm not dirtying another pot, okay? I don't have time for that. I think after my first kid or second kid, which was like over 10 years ago, I was like, I love this soup so much. I literally lived off of this soup when I went back to, before I even had my first kid. I started making this soup shortly after I got married, and when I was pregnant with my first, so I made a ton of these soups, and I lived off of them. I brought them to work with me every day. They were so delicious. So I'm pouring in the chicken stock now. By the way, if you don't know how to make chicken stock, like, it's so simple. And this is how I strain it. Just use a strainer, either right into a pot, or I strain it. Usually I strain it and store it in the freezer. And so I'll use a smaller strainer, and I'll strain it directly into like a measuring cup, because these strainers don't fit into my soup containers. But that's it. It's really so simple. So if I have them already strained and in the freezer, then I'll just dump a container in. But basically the recipe is super easy. It's you saute the onion for a few minutes, then you saute the squash for a few minutes, and then once everything is sauteed for like 3 to 5 minutes, which I never do. I do much longer than that. I saute it for like half an hour. I really like the flavor of the sauteing. The reason I add the water, if you notice I kept adding a little bit of water, is because I don't want the vegetables to burn. So that's why I kept mixing. Like I skipped a lot of the mixing in this video, and in a lot of the videos that I'm going to show you, I skip a lot of the mixing. I mix my soups a ton. I obviously don't want the vegetables to burn. Okay, again, the soup does not call for turmeric. I'm throwing it in, and the no salt seasoning, I'm throwing it in. Well, the soup calls for salt and pepper. I don't like pepper so much, so I just put the no salt seasoning. And there's no measurement really on how much salt it calls for, so I threw in a tablespoon. The soup came out delicious. But again, I threw in the turmeric and all that other stuff. Like that's zucchini in there and garlic. The soup does not call for garlic, but that's because I wanted the additional flavor. Like I mentioned, my chicken stock didn't cook so long. And so I didn't feel like it had such a strong flavor. So that's why I added all those extra vegetables in. But the actual recipe is just exactly as I said. The onions, the squash. After you saute it for a few minutes, you add in the roux, which technically a roux is like melted butter. I'll put all the measurements in the description. Melted butter mixed with flour, whisk it together, and then scrape that all into the pot. If you actually want to go ahead and dirty another pot. I didn't melt butter, I just added more grapeseed oil to it, and I added the flour directly in. And obviously now it's like, I don't know, at least an hour later or something. You're supposed to simmer it for like 30 minutes after you add the vegetable stock. So after you add the roux, you mix it all together. So you have the sauteed vegetables and the roux mixed all together. Then you add the vegetable stock in, and then you simmer for like 30 minutes. And you add the salt and pepper whenever you want. Once you finish doing all that, then you puree it. You can either pour it into a blender or you can use an immersion blender, which is what I'm doing. And after you use the immersion blender, then you pour in the cream or the alternative milk, the heavy cream, whatever. If you use heavy cream, then obviously it's going to be dairy. Or if you want, you can use an alternative milk option, whatever. Then it will be dairy free. But yeah, the milk or the cream comes in after the soup is already pureed. Again, the soup looks so busy and complicated because I threw in so many more things. And obviously you don't need to use homemade vegetable stock, and you don't need to use homemade chicken stock. That's just the way I like to do it. You do what's easy for you. And so, do whatever is the quickest way to get the food on the table for you. One of the reasons I like to make the homemade chicken stock is because, like, I have the chicken soup anyways. What I do is I just take the chicken soup after we've used it, I top off the pot, like I add more water to the pot, and then I just boil it for 24 hours. And that's it. That's my chicken stock. So that's it for this soup. I do recommend doubling it like I did here. I mean, you could triple it or quadruple it if you have a large enough pot. But like I started to say before, but I think I went off on a tangent, the more vegetables you put into a soup, the heavier it's going to be, especially if it's like a heavy kind of vegetable. When it comes to soft vegetables like soft squash, it's a lot easier. But a heavy vegetable like butternut squash, even broccoli, which is pretty soft, it's hard to triple this recipe. That's why I needed the metal spoon, because it got a little heavy for the mixing. Not that it was too heavy for me to handle, but it was very bulky. You'll see if you double it or triple it. It's very easy to double, but if you triple it, make sure you have a larger pot, like at least a 12-quart pot, I think. But this is an 8-quart pot that I'm using for this soup, and it doubled beautifully and very easily. As you can see, I am now putting my soups away. I have talked about this before. Make sure that when you are putting away food for the freezer that you label everything. So when I label these containers, I am going to mark that not that there's meat in them. I usually just put an M on my container lids if I've made it like with a meat ingredient. Not that it matters to you, but just for me to keep an idea of what's in my ingredients, to know what's what. Obviously, if you have any special ingredients, I've mentioned this before, sensitivities in your family or whatever, you want to note that on the container if you might be looking out for certain like allergies or whatever. Like if you have a nursing baby and you're testing foods out and stuff, definitely if you're trying out something new, if you're trying out like a new type of ingredient, that's what I'm talking about. If you're trying out like a new ingredient, definitely write down if you've put that in there, if you're like looking for sensitivities and things like that. But otherwise, just make sure you date it, like you write the date that you've made the soup. That way you know approximately when you need to finish it up by, and you will be good to go. Most freezers, you can keep things in there for a few months. I have a deep freezer at -10 degrees, I think I keep it, and so I don't mind if it's in there for like 6 months or longer. Okay, that was the butternut squash soup. We are on to the next soup, which I believe is a 13 bean soup, but we'll see momentarily. But yeah, I'm showing you this part, which I'm going to be soaking the beans because it is really important. Yeah, that's a 13 bean mix, so I did not measure all that stuff out. As you can see, it's all mixed together. Well, I mean, I technically could have, but meaning I didn't measure it out individually. Like I took that from a mix. I bought probably a 25-pound bag of 13 bean mix, probably from Winco. Winco is like a nice cheap store for like bulk stuff. I mean, it's good for anything, I guess. I will say something about Winco's produce. If you intend to buy produce there, yes, they have great prices on produce, but you kind of have to use it like the same day or the next day. That's one of the reasons I like to shop at Costco. It buys me a little bit more time. The produce is gorgeous. This is not a promo for Costco. I'm just explaining to you why I shop in different places. But yeah, things like bulk beans and things like that, I like to try and get them in bulk at, the best price I can. So yeah, no, I'm not going to be able to get those frozen onions into that pot because I need to soften them up first. So I just ran them underwater. I was starting this soup pretty late in the day. So when you saw me fill those containers with beans, that was earlier in the day. At this point, when I put the soup up, I think it's already close to like 2 or 3 o'clock at this point in the day, and so I did not have time to prep vegetables, which is great because I had the vegetables already in the freezer, already ready for me to go. So what the beans are doing now is probably cooking in the Instant Pot. If you saw, I think it was my split pea soup, whatever. It doesn't matter if you saw the video or not, but I talked about this, I think, in a different video, that I like to prep my beans and greens and stuff ahead of time, if possible, of course, only if possible. Don't stress about these kinds of things, okay? Do what you can, don't do what you can't. So I like to prep things ahead of time, but obviously with this 13 bean mix, I didn't prep it ahead of time, but I do like to cook it separate from the vegetables. Because it does take a long time for the beans to cook, I like to make sure that they are 100% fully cooked before I stick them in the pot with the vegetables, because if I have to continue cooking them after if I put them in not cooked into the pot with the vegetables, then the vegetables have to cook for a lot longer, and I don't want it to turn kind of like stocky. I don't want the vegetables to get overcooked because it changes the flavor. It's good to saute them. You can cook them for half an hour, whatever, even a little bit longer than an hour is fine. But once you start to cook vegetables in the pot for longer than an hour, sometimes, really it depends on the level of heat that you're using. But once you start to cook them for longer than like 30 minutes to an hour, again, depending on the level of heat, but after about an hour, it's going to start to change flavor. So I don't like that. So I go ahead and I cook my stuff in the Instant Pot, like the beans, the greens, things like that. You'll see I think in the next soup I'm going to do that too. But yeah, so I soaked the beans that morning, and that way it helped with digestibility. I don't think it sprouted in that time, and I'm not looking for like fully sprouted beans, but it's very healthy for like to have beans that are soaked and at least a little bit sprouted. Again, you don't have to actually see a sprout coming out. Once it starts to germinate like on the inside, that's already good for you. Yeah, you see I almost threw those carrots into my compost bowl. Okay, don't do that. Pay attention to what you're doing. I'm glad I caught myself, because I would have had to fish those carrots out of the compost bowl, which I get it, it's just vegetable peels, but it would have taken time, right? So anyways, yeah, the beans right now are cooking or done cooking, actually at this point, because I've already started the soup, and you'll see me throw the beans in soon. What I've done is, and I do this with all my beans and greens and things like that, if possible, is I'll cook it if I'm doing like beans for a soup, let's say like this one. So I'll take all the beans and I will, trying to shake my baby and rock him to sleep. No, not like shaking baby. I'm trying to rock him. What I do is I soak them as long as I can, and then I will fill up the Instant Pot with water, obviously to like the fill line, right? And then obviously fresh water, right? And then I will set it for an hour. I'll set it for an hour on high, so it cooks in the Instant Pot on high for an hour. Oh, by the way, I'm gonna put like all the ingredients in the description box so you can make this recipe below. But hopefully I'll summarize. So I think at this point, I can't even remember what I've put in. The creamy white colored stuff, like the cream colored stuff that you saw me throw in, was parsnip. The very white color stuff is turnip. And you see I'm just throwing in like handfuls of stuff. Those celery right there, that's probably about 2 pounds of celery right there. And when I throw in the yellow squash and zucchini, I will let you know how much I throw in, because I think I throw in the whole thing? Oh yeah, I threw in the whole bag. I had to skip over that part because my baby ended up in the camera. But yeah, I believe that there's about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of squash in each bag, and I just dumped in the rest. So like I did like approximately 1.5 pounds of yellow squash, approximately 1.5 pounds of zucchini, and really you could put whatever you want. That is the beauty of this soup. You could put any vegetables in it. It's a 13 bean soup, so you don't even have to use 13 different kinds of beans, but I mean, that's how they sell the mix, okay? So it makes more sense to use the mix, because then you don't have to go measuring out a whole bunch of different kinds of beans. So you saw I didn't perfectly measure the beans at the beginning, so you can use however many beans you want. I like to use a lot of beans. So like I said, I cook them for an hour in the Instant Pot, and then I do a natural release. So they cook on high for an hour. Okay, that's turmeric. And again, there's not really measurements, okay? I don't measure my food, okay? That's the no salt seasoning from Costco. I do salt my food, but I actually like that no salt seasoning, so I use that in addition. I'm peeling the garlic right now. I like to put a bunch of garlic in my food, and I probably would have wanted to use a full head for this. But I think I was running low on time. So I probably only put in like, I don't know, 10 or 12 cloves or something like that. This, by the way, I believe what I'm using is my 12 quart stock pot. Yeah, it looks like my big pot. So that's a huge recipe, okay? This is gonna make a lot. You'll see at the end when I container it up, this is gonna make a lot. And so this is a great meal for like putting in the freezer, postpartum, like going back to, if you plan to go back to work, this is really going to help with like pumping, nursing, whatever. My kids actually love this soup. My kids like a lot of my soups. I think they like all my soups. I usually have one kid that doesn't. Oh, by the way, those were 1/8 cup measuring cups. So then I guess in total that was a 1/4 cup of salt, which sounds like a lot, but if you actually break it down, yep, that spoon is falling, but I think I'm going to catch it. If you break it down, it ends up only being a teaspoon per quart of soup. So that is a 12 quart pot, and so I think that ends up being 12 teaspoons of salt, which again sounds like a lot. But I did not salt the beans when I cooked them in the Instant Pot. So the salt that I just put in, that's all the salt. So keep in mind that if you use beans that are salted, you are going to want to, like, let's say you use canned beans for this recipe. You could literally use any kind of beans you want, okay? So if you want to use canned beans, if you want to use dry beans, if you cook the dry beans separately, but you salt the pot that you cook the beans in, then obviously reduce the amount of salt that you're going to put into the soup. I did not put salt in my beans, so that's why a 1/4 cup of salt for this thing was totally fine. Okay, like I mentioned, I do a natural release on the beans in the Instant Pot. And by the way, you don't need an Instant Pot. If I didn't have the Instant Pot, I would just be cooking the beans in a separate pot on the stove. Again, I just want to make sure, I'm just testing the vegetables here to see if they're like soft enough for me to add the beans in. Because once I add, okay, you see I'm using that metal spoon again. It's a different day, but I'm using the metal spoon. Oh my gosh, the bubbling beans, it's so satisfying to look at that. Yeah, so they are fully, obviously the vegetables were soft enough. Although I'll be perfectly honest, I'm looking at those vegetables. Some of them look like they can, yeah, that zucchini looks like it can cook for a few more minutes. So that makes a lot of sense because I did mix this soup a lot after I stuck the beans in. I think I cut a lot of that time out because you don't need to watch me stirring a pot for 10 minutes. I would mix it in. I think I mixed it and came back and mixed it and came back. You do want to make sure that with a thick soup like this is going to be for like this bean soup. If you make like, let's say, a split pea soup, any soup with heavy ingredients that sink to the bottom, you want to make sure to be constantly mixing. Okay, I shouldn't say the word constant. You want to make sure to be mixing it regularly. Because what will happen is if you don't mix it regularly, the heavy stuff is going to fall to the bottom and it will burn. But if you come back every few minutes and, yep, see, I'm going to probably try and walk away, but I think I'm going to smell the soup and decide that I need a sweet potato or another carrot. Yep, there I go. So I think I used 12 carrots in this recipe, and I wish I had used like 13 or 14 because I really like to use a lot more carrots. I was running kind of low on time though, and so I think that's why I only did the 12 carrots, but I'm sticking in I believe it's 2 jars of baby food carrot baby food, oh my gosh. And then you're gonna see, I think I'm gonna come back and put in sweet potato baby food also. I don't normally cook with sweet potatoes, but sometimes I feel like it could like enhance the recipe. You will notice I don't cook with potatoes and tomatoes a lot. I use them kind of sparingly. So if you would like to add potatoes and tomatoes to your recipes and your food, go for it. I personally don't use them so much, but if you add them to your recipes will be delicious. Actually, if you want to turn this into a minestrone soup, not that there's any more space in this pot to do so, but if you wanted to do this at home and your pot had more space, you could probably go ahead and add a bunch of tomatoes in, either canned tomatoes or just fresh tomatoes, whatever you want. And if you add pasta, that's basically a minestrone soup. I mean, you'll need some Italian. Okay, you don't need anything. You can do it however you want. But this is very similar to how I make a minestrone soup. I go ahead and I add, oh, someone sneaks into the camera. I go ahead and I add tomatoes, and usually canned tomatoes. Yep, there's the baby food sweet potato, or sweet potato baby food. Okay, whatever. Yeah, I added, I think it was just 2 jars. Go ahead, if you want to make a minestrone soup, add tomatoes in any shape or form, okay? Add whatever you have. If you have diced tomatoes, add diced tomatoes. If you have fresh tomatoes, add fresh tomatoes, dice them up, chop them up, whatever. If you have, I guess, tomato paste, I don't know. I don't think I've ever made minestrone soup with just tomato paste, but like, try it if that's what you have, I guess. I don't know. I do think it's nice to have like tomatoes in there. I don't know, whatever. Anyways, if you're going to make minestrone soup, after you add tomatoes, you also want to add Italian seasoning. Again, season it to taste. If you like it strong, add extra. If you don't like it strong, start with a little bit and taste it. And then after it's all finished cooking, you just cook a pot of pasta and add it in. You can make macaroni, like elbow noodles, whatever floats your boat. But it's basically the same soup. Okay, so how many containers do I have there? 2, 4, 6, 8. I think I need 10 containers for that soup. Let's find out if I grab 2 more containers. Yes, I do need to attend to that overflowing bowl of dough on my counter. Okay. You noticed in the other video, in the other soup, the butternut squash, I just picked it up and poured it into the containers. So the reason I'm not doing that in this one, well, first of all, the pot is extremely heavy. This is a 12 quart, not an 8 quart, so it's much heavier. But you'll notice all the way down to the bottom, I'm still scooping it out. And the reason for that is because there's chunks in this soup. If I were to pour it, it's going to make a splash. It's not like a straight, not straight solid. It's not like a smooth, that's the word I'm looking for. It's not just a smooth liquid that if you just pour it, it just goes and flows smoothly. Another thing I want to point out is, I know I've sped up the camera because I'm doing the same thing over and over again, but I want to point out that as I was scooping up with the ladle, I mixed it. I stirred the pot you see how my hand went in a circular motion? I want to mix because otherwise the heavy stuff settles to the bottom. So as I scoop up the beginning of each container, I don't do it so much at the end of the containers or towards the middle, but as I start each container, like filling up, at the beginning of filling up each container, I always stir the pot again. So you don't have to stir it every time you ladle up one ladle full, but every time you start a new container, you should stir the pot again just to make sure that you're mixing everything around, you're getting all the different ingredients into each container. Again, only necessary to really do at the beginning of each container, not at each ladle full. I'm just trying to top these off as much as possible just because if you fill up your containers enough that there's no space at the top, then your soup won't get freezer burnt. So I'm leaving a little bit of space obviously for the soup to expand, as liquid does expand in the freezer, but not too much so you don't want to put too much. Obviously you don't want the lid to pop off. But you also don't want to put too little because you don't want it to get freezer burnt inside the freezer if it sits for too long in the freezer. Again, I'm just labeling everything up. How many containers did I end up with there? 3, 6, 9, 10. Yeah, I did do 10 in the end. Okay. And everything else we just had for dinner that night. And this is one of the things I love about this soup. It's such a solid filling meal. You just heat up some baguettes and serve the soup, and it's like a full meal right there, ready to go. Obviously, it's much quicker and easier if everything is like pre-prepped ahead of time. Like you saw, I had most of the vegetables prepped already. The carrots took like longer than throwing everything else in, but I had most of everything prepped already. The beans in general are very easy to prepare. You soak them, you rinse them off, you throw them in a pot, and you turn it on. It's like literally so easy. And then especially if you get baguettes from the store, then like it's such an easy meal. Everyone loves it. If you're wondering why my kids like soup, I'm guessing it's because I served a lot of soup when they were little. I also like soup. I mean, obviously, if you eat a lot of something, like they talk about this, I think there's research on it. Like if you eat a lot of something when you're pregnant and nursing, then your kids are going to have a tendency to like the thing that you eat a lot of. Not necessarily too much of, but like just something that you eat frequently while you are pregnant or nursing. So these are foods that I've eaten for a long time, and thank God, I'm very grateful my kids like this food because it is very healthy and good for them, and me. So that's it for that soup. It's, again, such an easy soup, and I highly encourage you to at least make a double batch of any soup that you're going to make. So now I'm starting on the mushroom barley soup. It was so cold the week that I made these soups. I had made a whole menu plan ahead of time, and then we suddenly got hit with temperatures in the 30s at night, and maybe some of you are thinking like, oh, that sounds normal for winter. Not here in Phoenix. So it was so cold. I was just like so freezing, and I felt like soup was definitely in order. So I just abandoned ship with my menu plan, and every day I made soup, and I served it up with like either baguettes or quinoa or pasta. Some days I offered 2 options or maybe all 3. I can't remember at this point. But soup and baguettes is definitely a win-win in our house. I think I hadn't done not pasta. I hadn't done quinoa in a while. By the way, I was showing you on the pot. I had filled up the water to the fill line, and I will again. I'll leave the recipe in the description box. Actually, for this recipe, okay, I don't really follow recipes, but I use a lot more barley than the recipe calls for because, well, I believe in actually having barley in my mushroom barley soup. I know some mushroom barley soups. Did I tell you that's what we were making? We're making mushroom barley soup. Some mushroom barley soups I've had, like, there's like, you can see the barley floating around. There's like some pieces of barley here and there. And I like there to be like I like my, so that was my baby that you just heard waking up from his nap. But ultimately what I was saying is that I do like to have a lot of barley in my mushroom barley soup. You might think of it more as like a mushroom barley stew. I don't know, I guess because it's so thick, it's more of like a stew. Actually, I do really like to have thick soups. So for my kids who don't like thick soups, I just water it down a little bit. Literally at the time of serving them, I'll just add a little bit of water to their soup. Because I do have at least one kid off the top of my head that I can think of that has requested like a thinner soup. It is my older child, in case you're wondering. I do find that when the kids are younger, like, they don't really care necessarily as much. Like, if you're used to serving them similar foods or whatever, they'll just continue to eat the same things. When I say the same things, obviously they're going to get tired of the same food being served over and over again. But when I say the same thing, I mean, like, if you're used to serving thick soup and you continue to serve thick soup, obviously different varieties, different kinds of vegetables and beans and things like that, meats, different kinds of things like that. Obviously you want to keep things exciting, but same textures, similar kinds of flavors. Kids usually go pretty good for that. Like, kids are usually pretty good with that. It is also, I personally think it's a good idea to introduce different like cultural flavors, just to give them like a diverse palate, if you will, like just so that they're open to more like different kinds of foods and things like that. But if you're going to serve the same kinds of foods over and over again, your kids are usually going to be like good with that for a long time, at least when they're little. And that's one of the reasons I make so much soup, is because when my older kids were little, I made a ton of soup. I mean, like, that's what I eat when I'm nursing. This is like my staple food. If you're a breastfeeding mom, I'm telling you, soup is going to be your best friend because it is so hydrating. It's so filling. I mean, obviously, depending on what you put in it. Did I share the butternut squash soup in this video? I think I did. Sorry, it's been a couple days now. But yeah, the butternut squash soup, it's delicious, but it's not very filling. It doesn't have a lot of protein. There's not a lot of grain in it. Like, it's just a yummy soup, so it's great like for hydration, but it's not very filling. So like I said, I will put the recipe in the description box below. I do adjust the barley, and obviously I will put the original recipe and I will put my adjustments. With this soup, I'm pretty much sticking to the recipe for the most part. Like, obviously I'm putting more barley in. I believe this soup actually calls for like Worcestershire sauce. I'm sure I'm messing up the pronunciation of that. Worcestershire, I don't know how it's pronounced, but anyways, I think the soup calls for that. Or soy sauce, one or the other, I can't remember. If you do put it in, it makes the soup taste delicious, but I'm not doing so hot on soy right now. I don't think my baby can have it, so I'm not putting it in. This soup does call for white wine, which I don't believe I put it on camera when I was I don't believe I had the camera on when I was putting it in. So it does call for white wine. You'll see that in the description box, and it makes all the difference. I will tell you that when I put the white wine in, and the white wine goes in all the way at the end, like when you're done cooking the whole entire soup, that's when you add the white wine in. So for now, what we've done is we've put oil in the pot. I don't know if you saw me put the oil in or not, because I know I had to wear my baby at some point, and I'm trying to keep my kids out of the videos. But basically, to jump around here, the soup so far goes like this. You put the oil in, you saute the onions, and again, these recipes tell you to saute for like 3 to 5 minutes. I don't do that. I like to saute for longer, although with the mushrooms, by the time I got the mushrooms in, it was already really, really late. And you'll notice that if you look carefully, you'll see after I pour the barley in, the mushrooms are still pretty white. By the way, these are cremini mushrooms. They're like the baby portobello mushrooms. I don't really like to use white mushrooms. There's nothing wrong with them. They're amazing. They're perfect. I mean, maybe not so amazing. I don't think they're amazing because I think cremini mushrooms are amazing. White mushrooms are great. They're totally fine. I have been using cremini mushrooms, these brown mushrooms, for so long. I'm so used to the flavor of them, and I love the flavor. So that's what I usually cook with and like serve in my salads and things like that. But you can use white mushrooms, you can use brown mushrooms, whatever floats your boat. So basically, into the pot, you've now seen me sauteing the onions and the mushrooms. Try to saute and cook everything until all the vegetables are fully cooked through. I think I talked about this before, is that if the vegetables are not fully cooked before you put the next part in, like the grain, like the barley, you're gonna have to mix a lot. And I actually cut out a lot of the mixing time, so you don't see me mixing so much. But once I put the barley in, because the mushrooms weren't completely done cooking, and mushrooms cook really fast, but I put the barley in too soon. It looks like I'm doing the garlic over there. I put the barley into the pot too soon, and the mushrooms weren't finished cooking, and so I had to keep mixing. Yep, you see the mushrooms are still kind of white, and I'm already putting the barley in. Don't do that, okay? Because now I had to keep mixing the soup because the barley is very heavy and it sinks to the bottom. So what happens is that if the barley sinks to the bottom and you keep, like that soup, I think it's on like 3 or 4 on the setting on the stove. So it's like a medium setting, basically, a medium heat. So if I just leave it there to cook, even if I turn it to like 2, if I turn it down to low, first of all, it would take much longer. I don't want to do that. But once the barley goes in, barley is very heavy. It's going to sink to the bottom, and it's going to burn if you just leave it there to cook the mushrooms. So you have to keep mixing, or I had to keep mixing. You're not going to put the barley in until the mushrooms are finished cooking, hopefully. So yeah, don't do that. Wait until the mushrooms are completely finished cooking. Wait till the onions and the mushrooms are completely finished cooking. And then add the barley in. Okay, so into the pot for the liquid, you can use a vegetable stock, you can use a chicken stock, or you can use water. I believe the recipe itself calls for water. I don't like to cook with water. I mean, obviously you will see in my cooking videos that I do add water as I'm cooking. It's usually to keep the bottom of the pot like moist. What do I mean by that? Is I don't want the vegetables that I'm sauteing, I don't want them to burn while I'm cooking them. So if I feel like things are getting too dry down there and I don't want to add more oil, then I'll add water. But for the bulk liquid of the pot, I do like to add a vegetable or a chicken stock. I believe into this soup I added a chicken stock. I believe I usually add a chicken stock to the mushroom barley soup. And then you won't see it, but like I mentioned earlier, once it's finished cooking, do you see those mushrooms? They're kind of still whitish. So I'm gonna keep having to come back and just mix this over and over again. So at this point, the soup is basically done. I'm gonna keep mixing it. If you put in the barley after all the vegetables are already fully cooked, then once you add in the vegetable or chicken stock, I'm gonna add in a little bit more stock, you'll see. Once you add it in, you can just simmer it for like 20-30 minutes, however long you want, mixing it occasionally. Simmer it on low so it doesn't burn. Add in the wine. I will put all the measurements in the description box below, but I will let you know I usually throw in a lot more wine than the recipe calls for. So if it calls for like a 1/4 cup, I usually put in like a 1/2 to a cup. So, take that as you may. I like wine in my food. But yeah, I'm going to also throw in some seasoning. I did record myself putting the soup away, but I didn't think you needed to watch that again because you already watched that with the other soups. So I didn't want to bore you with that 3 times in a row in one video. But yeah, after you let the soup simmer for a little bit, you put the wine in before you let it simmer. So the wine is pretty much the last ingredient that goes in. I had run out of wine, so I actually had to go get wine. My husband went and got the wine for me. But yeah, I threw in the wine much later. Oh my gosh, I love watching it bubble like that. It's so satisfying. So yeah, I'm just putting in the seasoning, and then the soup is done. And then just remember that when you put it away in the freezer, to please label it with what it is and to date it, so that way, just put the date on it that you made it, so that way you know when you need to finish it up by. Let me know in the comments down below, what is your favorite soup to make? What is the easiest soup that you make? And what soup is your family's favorite? I'm very curious to know that down below. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.